Hello, my name is Steve O'Reilly, and welcome to Roma Locuta Est Considers. And what is RomaLocutaEst.com, you might well ask yourself. Well, it's a wee, humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it is devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We here at RomaLocutaEst.com, we do not seek, nor do we accept donations. No funding is received from any source. We're beholden to no one, and we alone are responsible for the content. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about my background, you can find it on the About section on the RomaLocutaEst.com blog site. But here I'll just say that I also write fiction. I'm working on a trilogy entitled Pia Fidelis. It's a historical fiction trilogy set in the time of the Arian crisis of the 4th century. It's a tale of war, adventure, betrayal, romance, and faith that includes the rise of Julian the Apostate, who St. John Henry Newman had considered a shadow of the Antichrist. Book 1 is complete. It's entitled The Two Kingdoms, and I'm hard at work on book 2. Many Catholic commentators have likened our times to the Arian crisis, so if you want to see how that turned out, get your copy today. It's available on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, and hardback, or it's available through other fine distributors such as Barnes & Noble. This current episode of Roma Locuta Est Considers continues its look at Benepapism. The material and content of this episode and all prior episodes has been based on articles found on the blog RomaLocutaEst.com. There's various compilations that you can find there looking at just about every aspect of the controversy possible. And those articles, in addition to other research, form the basis of my book, which you see on your right, which is entitled Valid, The Resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, The Case Against the Benepapists. And this is episode 8 of Roma Locuta Est Considers. We continue our look at Benepapism. Today's episode is entitled The Always is Also a Forever. This is part 1 of 2 parts, where we look at the last audience of Benedict on 27 February 2013. We look at the Benepapist interpretation of that document, or of the key paragraph within it, and we'll provide a reply to that. Those following the Benepapist controversy are no doubt already well aware that there's essentially 2 main theories, Benepapist theories. The first is that Benedict had an erroneous idea of the papal munus, or that he only partially resigned, a partial resignation, that he was in error, and these Benepapists will point to Canon 188, which states a resignation submitted out of grave fear, which has been unjustly inflicted, or because of fraud, or substantial error, or simony, is invalid by the law itself. So here they focus on saying that, okay, Benedict was in error in his resignation, that he misunderstood basically the nature of the papacy. So that's one theory. The other theory is, the main theory is that Benedict intentionally created a self-impeded see, that he either essentially faked his resignation, or he only resigned basically the doing of the papacy and not the papacy itself. We covered some of that already in the first 5 parts of this series on the munus versus the ministerium. But this is just a little bit of background before we get into the last audience. Okay, here's a screenshot of the opening of Benedict's last general audience. You can find this on the Vatican website. As I said, the last general audience of Benedict happened on Wednesday, 27 February 2013. I recommend, well, to read it if you're interested in the controversy, especially if you're someone who has accepted the interpretations proposed by the likes of Anne Barnhart, Mark Doherty, or Dr. Edmund Mazza, I think you should read it, and we'll get into it. It'll be way too long of a video. This is already probably going to be one of my more lengthy videos, but I'll try to touch upon some highlights that I think are important before we get to the key verse. But I certainly recommend that you, on your own time, take a look at it if Benepapism is important to you. Okay, this just by way as being a bit of a teaser, this is the key paragraph, or the paragraph, that the Benepapists always focus on to the exclusion of everything else. This is key for them. We'll get to it in more detail later, but just by way of a highlight, as I said, some of the key terms in this paragraph are the always is also a forever. So here they see this as indicating that Benedict is saying that he believes the being elected Pope leaves an indelible mark, that you have it always and forever, and therefore he can't really stop being Pope. Even if he resigns what he believes to be the active ministry of the Pope, he still retains deep inside ontologically a mark of the papacy on his soul, so therefore he'll always be Pope in some way. And this is the error that the likes of Anne Barnhart and Dr. Mazza kind of look at. So the always is forever is also forever. That's important to them. They'll point out that Benedict goes on to say, my decision to resign, the active ministry does not revoke this. So they'll say, oh, look, he says does not revoke this. So he believes, so Benedict must mean that the papacy is irrevocable. So there's more proof. And then also in that same line, this is, you get a twofer in this one line, Benedict talks about the active exercise of the ministry, and then the Benepapists who believe he made an error in his resignation will say, see that Benedict believed there's an active ministry, an active papacy, and a passive ministry. And I'll even point down to later on in this paragraph where he talks about the example of Saint Benedict talking about whether something is active or passive, and they'll say, see, this again is Benedict talking about there being an active and a passive papacy, therefore his partial attempt to resign is invalid in their minds. And of course you have the other Benepapists who believe he intentionally kind of faked his resignation or created a self-impeded see. They'll still point to here the active exercise of the ministry up here and say, yeah, he only intended to resign kind of part of the papacy, kind of like the doing of the papacy, but not the office of the papacy. So that's their argument. But we'll look at all this in greater detail as we go along. And just a little bit of history of kind of how I came to this controversy. I think I mentioned in my first introduction video that we here at Roma Lacuta Est, we're not fans of the Francis pontificate. Indeed, going back to when this blog began back in 2017, we had definitely have expressed continual concerns about Amoris Laetitia. We've looked at various controversies or theories about the conclave. I've written a bunch on the conclave of 2013. It's a series of articles called the Conclave Chronicles that you might have an interest in. So the point being here is that I'm not coming to the Benepapist controversy as a hyper skeptic. Okay, so as I said, I did not come to the Benepapist controversy hoping or wanting to be a debunker of it. I actually came to it kind of hopeful that maybe there was something to it. However, when I started looking at the articles of Anne Barnhart and Mark Doherty on it, and looking at what they claimed the last audience said, it was clear it did not say what they said it said, and that it did not mean what they said it meant. And that resulted in me just kind of having to be intellectually honest in writing my first article on the topic called Benedict is not Pope. Uh, so, like I said, the last audience does not mean what they say it means. It's clear to me, and we'll see as we go along, that they've read their own interpretations into it. The sad reality is that the last audience was a beautiful reflection by Benedict of a man who is stepping down from the papal throne. Unfortunately, the meaning of it has been mangled and its beauty deformed by the leading Benepapists who have sadly warped its meaning. Okay, so before diving into the last audience here directly, let's take a look at what some of the leading arch Benepapists have to say about the final audience. Anne Barnhart wrote, speaking of, she says here, just Pope Benedict's words from his so-called final audience on 27 February 2013, when cross-checked against canon law, that's at canon 188, I quoted up front, by themselves. So canon law and the last audience by themselves are enough to easily make the call, and that call is that Benedict made a substantial error in his resignation. Mark Doherty, who's actually, I think it was his article that got me looking at Benepapism much more closely in the last audience, he wrote in that article, before we get to the Declaratio, we need to review the smoking gun. The smoking gun. This is from Benedict's final general audience of 27 February 2013, the day before his invalid resignation did not become effective, where he exposes his erroneous notion of the indelible nature of the Petrine ministry. In doing so, he directly contradicts all the previous statements where he claims he was renouncing, leaving, and would then be pontiff, no longer but a simple pilgrim. This is the lens, this is key here from Mark Doherty. This is the lens through which we must evaluate the Declaratio. So Mark Doherty's view is that you begin with the Declaratio and you use that to interpret. You begin with the last audience and use that to interpret the Declaratio. And then finally here, Dr. Mazza, who's got his interpretation of the last audience, is basically kind of derivative of what Anne Barnhart and Mark Doherty had done prior to his entry into the controversy. But Dr. Mazza has a new book out there, and he writes, or in his book he says, like Sherlock Holmes, it's time to dig deeper. And that is the line he uses before he begins his analysis to claim that Benedict did not resign properly or resigned in error. And the very first document that he looks at in that effort to look deeper is the last audience. So from this, the point of all this is just to show the importance upon which the Benepapists look at the last audience. Okay, so let's start getting into the Benepapist interpretation of the famous paragraph before I get into my reply to it. Again, the always is also a forever. There can be no longer a return to the private sphere. My decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. I do not return to a private life, to a life of travel, meetings, receptions, and conferences, and so on. I am not abandoning the cross, but remaining in a new way. At the side of the crucified Lord, I no longer bear the power of the office of the governance of the church. But in the service of prayer I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. St. Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us the way for a life which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. Okay, let's look at the Benepapist interpretation of this. Okay, so here we're looking at a snippet from Mark Doherty's presentation of his interpretation of the last audience. The always is also a forever. Here he begins his analysis, the paragraph above that, which I actually think is a great place to start it. Most Benepapists you'll see in their articles, they always start with a forever, the always is always a forever, and they don't talk about the paragraph above it, because I think that's key to understanding the always is also a forever. But anyway, here in Mr. Doherty's presentation, the comments in red are his, and any underlines are his as well. But the curious thing here to note is that there's not much in red, so he's not providing many interpretive comments here for that paragraph above the always is also a forever. He just simply refers here, here Benedict says, here allow me to go back once again to 19 April 2005, and Mr. Doherty just puts in the helpful comment that this is a reference to Ratzinger's elevation to the papacy. So we have no other guide comments here from Mr. Doherty about what he's interpreting the meaning to be. He does underline some statements here and there, like the always is forever, always and completely, without stating how he interprets them. And then down here he no longer belongs to himself, he belongs to all, and all belong to him. And again, he doesn't state what that has to do with his interpretation. And actually, I'd argue it actually works against his interpretation, but we'll see that in a bit. Okay, so now we can get to the famous paragraph. The always is also a forever. Again, the words in red are Mark Doherty's interpretations of the lines before it. So Benedict says the always is also a forever. There can no longer be a return to the private sphere. And here Mr. Doherty puts his interpretation in of that. So Mr. Doherty is saying in his mind, so he's saying in Benedict's mind, the papal coronation indelibly anoints the pontiff in a distinct way, which is different from and more profound than priestly episcopal ordination or consecration. So again, this whole paragraph here is the smoking gun, according to Mr. Doherty. Remember the quote earlier, and this paragraph, which is the lens through which one should look back at the Declaratio. But for you, the viewer of this, my question is, okay, I understand this is Mr. Doherty's interpretation, but where does it come from? He gets all that from this one sentence. The always is also forever. There can be no longer return to this private sphere. From just that, he is inserting his own opinion. The papal coronation indelibly anoints the pontiff in a distinct way, which is different from and more profound than the priestly ordination. That's a lot of heavy lifting by that one line there. We'll look at that more closely, though, as I get to my formal reply. In the next sentence, Benedict says, my decision to resign the active exercise, and Mr. Doherty underlines active exercise of the ministry, does not revoke this, and does not revoke this is underlined too. So how does Mr. Doherty interpret that? Again, his commentary in red. The indelibility is, in Benedict's mind, irrevocable. Benedict is Pope forever, but in his mind, now exercising only part of the Petrine ministry. That's the active part, according to the Benepapists. So again, some heavy lifting by that one line there, and one has to wonder where and how this interpretation gets thrown upon those words. So I would argue that the Benepapists are reading into the text here, but later on I'll explain how that's clearly the case. So he goes on, Benedict says, I do not return to a private life, to a life of travel, meetings, receptions, conferences, and so on. And then Mr. Doherty underlines the next line, I am not abandoning the cross, but remaining in a new way. So I guess the Benepapists here would say, oh, he's not abandoning the cross. He's not leaving the papacy. He's kind of staying on in a new way is the meaning. And then it goes on here when Benedict says, I no longer bear the power of the office of the governance of the church, but in the service of prayer, I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. So the Benepapists there interpret that to kind of mean that Benedict is saying, I no longer bear the power of the office for the governance of the church, meaning I may have resigned in my mind the doing of the office, but I'm not resigning the office itself. And I'm kind of, with the bit of the office or the munis I've kept for myself, I'm going to keep on praying. And then they would then look for proof of that down here when Benedict says, Saint Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us a way of life which, whether active or passive, again, that's underlined by Mr. Doherty. So that's the point he's making, is that in the Benepapist view is that Benedict has kind of, in his mind, split the papacy between kind of an active papacy, which he resigned or thinks he resigned partially, and he kind of wanted to keep for himself this other part of the papacy where he can kind of be a contemplative pope, passive pope, in continuing on, while perhaps the next Pope Francis would kind of be the active pope. But that was what Benedict had in mind, and of course that's impossible, and therefore that would be the error that and Barnhart and company would call a substantial error by Canon 188. But again, just as a teaser here, we're looking at these red comments here. They're being inserted. They do not come from the text itself, obviously. This is Mr. Doherty's and the Benepapists' interpretation. And we'll move on and look more closely as to whether these are fair interpretations of these lines. All right, so let's kind of summarize what the Benepapists take. We did see Mr. Doherty's red-lined interpretations or red letter interpretations of the famous paragraph, the always is also forever. But here, looking again at Mark Doherty's article that I cite down here below, he immediately follows his analysis, which I just cited. He states, in summary, Benedict erroneously believes that acceptance of the papacy itself confers an indelible, irrevocable character on the man who accepts it, similar to the indelible marks of ordination to the priesthood and consecration to the episcopate, except in the case of becoming pope, there is no such thing. Therefore, in Benedict's mind, he, Benedict, remains pope even after he resigns the governing office and passes the throne to the next pope. This is substantial error. And he adds, honestly, I don't understand how anyone doesn't see it already at this point. Well, I've read the last audience. I don't see it, and I don't believe it's there. Dr. Mazza, again, who was kind of a later comer to the Benepapist controversy, shares basically the same view as Anne Barnhart and Mark Doherty. He says in his recent book, returning to his last audience, Ratzinger reminds the faithful that his renunciation of the active ministry does not revoke his original papal commitment of April 19, 2005, which is ongoing, always and forever. There's that line again. He is giving up the active power of the Petrine office for the government of the Diocese of Rome and the Universal Church, but not the passive power of the Petrine office denoted by the cross and by prayer. And then later on also, again from his book, he says, for Benedict, the Petrine Munis in his essence is spiritual, not functional. It is an ontological always, a forever that cannot be revoked. All right, so that is the Benepapist view. All right, so we've seen the Benepapist views of the always is also a forever, that paragraph. So let's look at their objections to the validity of Benedict's resignation based on the last audience and the always is also a forever paragraph. So objection one, having looked at what Mark Doherty and Dr. Matzev said and others, the always is also a forever is a reference to an indelible mark of the papacy in Benedict's mind. The second objection is where Benedict says, my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. He is saying, that is to say, the indelibility of the papal ministry is irrevocable. Benedict thinks he's a pope forever, but he will now exercise only a part of the Petrine ministry. And then the third objection is Benedict believed he could give up the power of jurisdiction or the active exercise, kind of like the active part of the papal munus. Thus, Benedict could say, I no longer bear the power of the office of the governance for the church. Yet, at the same time, he believed he could maintain the power of order. And again, these are using terms of Dr. Matza, but he believed he could maintain the power of order or the passive or contemplative part of the munus, and thus he could immediately add, right after saying that, but in the service of prayer I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. Okay, so we've seen the Benepapist arguments. We've seen their objections listed out, so now it's our turn. Let's offer a reply to those objections. Okay, first, I would like to establish a kind of a simple timeline to establish some context around the last audience. Obviously, first, February 11th, 2013, that was the day that Benedict read his Declaratio. Then, of course, on February 27th, almost 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks later, we have the last audience. And of course, it's this last audience that the Benepapists say is the smoking gun. It is the lens through which the Declaratio should be understood. So you're looking back in time to kind of understand the Declaratio through the last audience. So we're seeing that the Benepapists are interpreting the Declaratio via the last audience. So they're looking back, that's their lens to look back at the Declaratio. But that raises the question, all right, well, where is their interpretation of the last audience coming from? And I'm confident as we go through this analysis of the Benepapist interpretation of the last audience, we're going to see where it comes from. It's going to come from flawed logic, a misreading of the text, a reading into the text, some wishful thinking, exclusion of contrary evidence, and a healthy dose of gaslighting as well. Okay, on the timeline now you see a couple other events or documents have popped up. The first is Normas Nonnullus. It was a motu proprio issued by Benedict XVI in which he made some modifications to the conclave rules. He issued this on February 22nd, almost a full week before the last audience. It sheds some light on his thinking regarding the papacy. Also, Benedict spoke to some pilgrims from Albano on February 28th, the day of his actual resignation, the day that it became effective. A couple hours before it did, he spoke to these pilgrims, made some parting words to them, or left some parting words with them that I think also bear relevance, or have relevance to his intent as to his resignation. But none of these documents or events really show up in Benepapists' evaluation of what Benedict meant at his last audience on February 28th. All right, so let's take a quick look at these other documents. Let's start with a quick look back at the Declaratio. All right, this is the Declaratio as read on February 11th. Benedict says, "For this reason, and well aware of the seriousness of this act, with full freedom, I declare that I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome," not the active ministry, "I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. In such a way, the See of Rome, the See of St. Peter, will be vacant, and a conclave to elect the new Supreme Pontiff, not an additional one, the new one, will have to be convoked by those whose competence it is." And then he goes on here to talk about the cardinals, and now let us entrust the Holy Church to the care of our Supreme Pastor, our Lord Jesus Christ, and implore His Holy Mother, Mary, so that she may assist the Cardinal Fathers in her maternal her maternal solicitude in electing a new Supreme Pontiff. With regard to myself, I wish also to devotedly serve the Holy Church of God in the future through a life dedicated to prayer. So up here, he's saying, I'm gone. I'm vacating the See of St. Peter. And then down here, he said, with regard to myself now, I'm going to devote my life to prayer. So there is no bifurcation. He's saying, I was Pope, I'll be Pope no longer, and then I'm going to go live a life of prayer. That's what he's saying in the Declaratio. Okay, we saw the Declaratio, and now just a few days or 5 days before his last audience, Benedict released a motu proprio, Normas Non Nullas, on February 22nd, 2013, in which he made some modifications to the conclave rules. Okay, and here's just a screen grab of Normas Non Nullas from the Vatican website, where you can go and find and read for yourself. Norma Non Nullas of the Supreme Pontiff Benedict XVI on certain modifications to the norms governing the election of the Roman Pontiff. Now, again, to underline the fact that this was issued by Benedict on February 22nd, he did it realizing, obviously, that a conclave was necessitated by his resignation. And so it is a key to understanding what his frame of mind was in terms of what the papacy is or was, or what his position would be following his resignation, and certainly following the next conclave. Okay, so in Normas Non Nullas, as I mentioned, Benedict made some modifications to the conclave rules, and just don't need to go through all of them. They're pretty minor. One of the most significant ones is that he changed the timing, since the prior rules kind of envisioned a deceased pontiff, and you'd have to wait a certain amount of time for the funeral rites and so forth before you could start a conclave. Benedict, on February 22nd, since obviously he's resigning, he changed the rules that would allow the conclave to be held much earlier if all the cardinals were in town, in Rome. So that's one of the probably more significant changes he made. But clearly he understood that conclave was about to come because he was in fact resigning. But one of the changes I'd like to draw your attention to affected Section 87 of the former rules, which were written by John Paul II in Universi Dominici Gregis, UDG, in UDG paragraph 87, or to that, Benedict made some changes to the wording, and it's really not necessary to go through what that wording was. Probably just the thing I draw your attention to is the historical inclusion of the line that once the man elected by the cardinals is elected, he is asked the following question: do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff? That's the terminology that's used. Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff? Now, again, keep in mind, Benedict made certain changes to UDG, many other things, most other things he left untouched. So what conclusion do you draw from that is that he was happy with what UDG said elsewhere. So the paragraph following 87, which he did modify, is paragraph 88, which he did not modify. So again, Benedict was happy with this. And what happens in paragraph 88? Well, it states that after his acceptance, the person elected, if he has already received episcopal ordination, is immediately Bishop of Rome, true Pope, head of the College of Bishops. He thus acquires and can exercise full and supreme power over the universal church. So that is what Benedict expected to happen immediately following his resignation. When the conclave was held and had its results, he expected that there would be the election of a man who would immediately be Bishop of the Church of Rome, who would be true Pope, head of the College of Bishops, and who could exercise full and supreme power over the universal church. So Benedict expected someone else to be true Pope. Why? Because he was going to be no longer true Pope. He expected this man elected would exercise full and supreme power. So there's no way that Benedict could have thought that he could just give up the active power and retain some passive power. This new man would have exercised full and supreme power. He would not have full and supreme power if Benedict still retained something. He would not be the true Pope if Benedict still retained something of the papacy. So it's clear from this, quite obvious, that Benedict in no way could think that he could be true Pope or partial Pope in any way following his resignation. Okay, so let's get to the events of February 28th, the day after the last audience. Let's see what Benedict might say that might influence our understanding of what he said in the last audience. Okay, so just to show real quick, here's the document that appears on the Vatican website. You can go there and find it. It's the greeting of His Holiness Benedict XVI to the faithful of the Diocese of Albano at the Apostolic Palace of Castel Gandolfo on Thursday, 28 February 2013. And this all took place. His greeting was, I think, about 5:30 in the evening. His resignation went into effect at 8 o'clock. All right, so let's take a look at Benedict's words to the pilgrims from Albano, Italy. And this is, again, probably a couple hours, 2.5 hours before his effective resignation at 8 p.m. that evening, later that evening. So Benedict said, "I'm happy to be with you, surrounded by the beauty of creation and your kindness, which does me great good. Thank you for your friendship and your affection. You know that this day is different for me from the preceding ones." Benedict continues, "I am no longer the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church, or I will not be, or I will be until 8 p.m. this evening, and then no longer. I am simply a pilgrim beginning the last leg of his pilgrimage on this earth." So here you have Benedict saying explicitly, I am no longer the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church, or will no longer be it in a short while, but he will no longer be the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church. There's no question of munus here, or ministry, just Supreme Pontiff, he will no longer be. We saw it in the Decoratio. He talks about how he's going to vacate the See of Peter, the chair of the See of Rome, the See of Peter, and how a conclave to elect a new Supreme Pontiff will be necessary. Why? Well, he says it here because he's no longer going to be it. And also he says here that I'm just going to be simply be a pilgrim, beginning the last leg of his pilgrimage on earth. And that is also consistent with the Declaratio, where he talks about vacating the See of Peter, the election of a new Supreme Pontiff is necessary, and then, oh, by the way, I'm now going to devote my life to prayer. Now, in Normas Non Nullas, which we just looked at, we saw in at least that he made some changes to paragraph 87 of UDG, but 88 he left untouched. Why? Because he was happy with it. In that, it talked about that upon acceptance of his election, the man elected is immediately Supreme Pontiff, immediately Bishop of Rome, true Pope, with full and supreme power. So by saying I'm no longer going to be Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church here to the pilgrims of Albano, clearly Benedict is saying I'm no longer going to be the true Pope. So he's no longer true Pope, he's no longer Supreme Pontiff, he's no longer Bishop of Rome. It's quite clear. But what is the Benepapist response to this? I quoted you earlier from Mark Doherty, and again, I'm just reading here from that same article from before, from him. He states, before we get to the Decoratio, we need to review the smoking gun. This is from Benedict's final general audience of 27 February 2013. That's the day before Benedict said this. The day before, the day before his invalid resignation did not become effective, where Benedict exposes his erroneous notion of the indelible nature of the Petrine ministry. And here's a key line from Mr. Doherty. He says, in doing so, he, Benedict, directly contradicts. So he's saying the general audience, the always is forever, that whole paragraph, he directly contradicts all those previous statements where he claims he is renouncing, leaving, and would then be pontiff no longer, but a simple pilgrim. So he's saying the statement of the last audience does contradict what he said in the Decoratio, and he says it does contradict what we just read over here in terms of what Benedict said to the pilgrims of Albano. So the Benepapists are admitting there's a contradiction. So there is no attempt to kind of reconcile these statements. I think that's key, because what they're obviously doing then is that they're excluding this evidence and excluding Normas Non Nullas. Now, we might get into a separate question of the Ratzinger Code and all that kind of crazy stuff, and perhaps we'll do an episode on this, but for the purpose of this analysis, Mark Doherty, the Ann Barnharts, the Dr. Matzes see the statement to the Pilgrims of Albano as being contradicted by the last audience. So, what do we see? We've talked about the Decoratio. We took a brief look back at that. What Benedict said. We took a brief look at Normas Non Nullas, what it had to say about Benedict clearly understanding that the next pope was going to be the Supreme Pontiff, the true Pope with full and supreme powers in the church, no partial powers left over for somebody else. And we saw in Benedict's comments to the Pilgrims of Albano the day after the last audience that he said, I am no longer, I will no longer be Supreme Pontiff after 8 p.m. that evening. So what's the Benepapist response to all that? So what's the Benepapist response to all that? Well, it's to exclude the evidence that doesn't fit their narrative. So they don't try to explain it and try to find consistency between these statements over the course of Benedict's last, 2 or so weeks as Pope. Instead, they just exclude Normus non nullis. They exclude his comments to the Pilgrims of Albano. And then with regard to the Declaratio, they interpret it through the lens of the last audience. So they are putting all their marbles on the last audience here. Okay, so we're reaching here the end of part one of 2 parts. But we have I think we can make some preliminary conclusions thus far. I think we've seen signs that the Benepapists are imposing an interpretation on the last audience. We saw that with the red letter parenthetical comments of Mark Doherty as he was commenting on the text of the always is also a forever. We've seen that the Benepapist interpretation contradicts other contemporaneous documents. We saw this clearly the case in terms of Normus non nullis, where Benedict, by not making any changes to some of the UDG commentary, clearly understood that his successor would be fully the true Pope, the Supreme Pontiff, with full and supreme power that he could exercise. There is no room in any of those formulations for a partial Pope or a Pope who kept part of the munus or anything like that. We also saw in Benedict's greeting on the day of his resignation on February 28th, 2013, that he told the pilgrims that he would no longer be the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church as of 8 p.m. that evening. And we read that the Benepapist, Mark Doherty, for example, who's closely tied to Anne Barnhart and Dr. Matza, said that contradicts the general audience. So he wants to go with the general audience because he thinks that supports his narrative that Benedict made a substantial error. So he's excluding evidence that contradicts that narrative. And that's certainly not the proper approach. These comments were made one day after the general audience. Normus non nullis was only 5 days, issued 5 days before the general audience, and of course the Declaratio itself was about a little more than 2 weeks before the general audience. So the goal of any interpretation is to see that these documents, Benedict is being consistent between them. It's illogical to think that his opinion changed from day to day in terms of whether or not he was going to be Supreme Pontiff anymore in any way. So what we see here is the Benepapist reaction has been to exclude contrary, non-conforming evidence that just doesn't agree with their thesis. They just ignore it. They exclude it. This is a flawed approach. Given the documents are contemporaneous, as I said, these are 4 documents, 4 occasions, 4 speaking moments by Benedict over the course of about 16, 17 days. They should be read in a manner that recognizes their consistency and does not exclude any of it. So in the upcoming part 2, we will look at the last audience now more directly, and the always is forever. We've kind of this part has been about this episode has been in way of an introduction to part 2, where we will now get into the meat of the general audience itself and look directly at the paragraph where Benedict speaks of the always is also a forever, and there we will prove that the Benepapist interpretation is flawed. And here I include, as I have all along, include some resources. You can just put this on pause if you'd like to see what else you might be able to find and read on the Benepapist or the arguments against the Benepapists. Okay, so that concludes episode 8. This was part 1 of 2 on the Always is also a forever. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for part 2. I thank you for your attention. This episode ran a little bit longer than my other ones, but I think it's necessary to really get into the last audience, given the in great detail, given the importance that the Benepapists themselves place upon it. So, again, thank you for sticking with me. I hope I'm getting better at this, and thank you for your time and attention. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, please subscribe, and if you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down and don't subscribe. Again, thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you.